Hello again. This is George LeMieux from the Gunster Law Firm. Welcome you to Gunster's View from the Top. And we literally are talking to the top of the political world in terms of evaluating what happens in Florida politics. I'm pleased to be here with our guest, Dr. Susan MacManus, who for 30 years was the distinguished professor at the University of South Florida. And although she is supposed to be retired, I don't think she is, because she's doing just as much work these days. And here we are, just 48 hours from the election day, and America is still counting. And it's my privilege to welcome you here, Dr. MacManus. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. What an election.
What an election. You know, that we think they can't get more interesting. And to me, this might be the most interesting Florida election that we've had in my memory, maybe going back to 2000. And what really interests me is the shifting vote, the changing of the demographic, who came out to vote, who didn't vote, who voted which way. So I'd like to start with that. Tell us what you're seeing in the numbers. Donald Trump wins Florida by some 400,000 votes, more than anyone predicted. And we're seeing some really interesting developments on how people voted.
We certainly are. And of course, nothing is a bigger story than the Latino vote, which we in Florida have known for some time is quite diverse. And country of origin and the experiences and cultural differences really matter a lot, more than party. And we also saw the result of a growing Latino population, which was formed a coalition in South Florida on the issue of socialism, something that was very real to people. And the Republicans figured it out early. A lot of it comes from the lieutenant governor and the senator and others that are very familiar with that community. But for many years, it was assumed that it was just Cubans that would vote Republican. But this time, the coalition expanded, and it included Nicaraguans, Colombians, Venezuelans, Hondurans, anyone that had had an experience with socialism. And it became a coalition that was just cemented together, and it was very, very high turnout, and it affected races all over the place. The congressional races, which were flipped in Southeast Florida, a lot of other races across that area. And it just goes to show that you can't just take broad categories of people by race or gender or whatever and really understand the nuances that characterize Florida politics. So that's one thing we really notice. In terms of longevity, it's really important because by 2040, this state is projected to be a majority non-white. What's going to be the fastest growing element? The Latino vote and Latinos. And I think this really signals the beginning of their growing clout, and it's not going to slow down in Florida politics. And not only was it just observed there, it was also in other parts of the state where they had Hispanic populations. And we even saw that the Puerto Rican vote, which is long presumed by many that don't study that population very well to be all Democrats, that vote was fairly split as well. And turnout was a little bit lower for that group, which is understandable. But this is a real sea change in Florida politics.
It really is. And, you know, for those who are outside of Florida, they label everyone as Latino, and they don't understand that, you know, if you're a Mexican American in California, you feel very differently about politics than some of the groups and countries of origin people that you mentioned just a moment ago. So, you know, looking forward in terms of how Florida will perform, you've got Marco Rubio, who's coming up, I guess, on a ballot here in 2 years. That's got to be an encouraging sign for him that these Hispanic coalitions came out and voted Republican in the way that they did. And you would have thought that Democrats, who are not just in Washington, but the Florida Democratic Party, would have known that this was happening. And we heard, you know, before the election, the alarm bells going off from Democrats in Miami-Dade County, yet I didn't seemingly see any response or effort to try to stem the tide. I was wondering if you were aware if the Democrats tried to react in any way to what seemed to be and what turned out to be a, you know, Hispanic wave for Trump in Southeast Florida.
They did try, and there were efforts. I mean, the former vice president himself came down, Kamala Harris came down, met with Hispanic, Latino groups and so forth. I think one of the problems that Democrats had in general, and this is just reflective of it, their polling operation is not very good, and it reflects an inattention to the nuances of Florida. And not only was it bad for, the party, it was bad for some of the candidates who thought they were ahead in races, and they were not. And this is I think one of the things that Florida Democrats have now recognized loud and clear. Relying on outside polling firms or outside consultants that don't know the nuances of Florida doesn't work. The Republicans have been much better over the last 2 or 3 election cycles of relying more upon locals, people who know the community and have a personal contact and have a way to find out what's on people's mind at any point in time instead of just a poll. And to another point that you were making, it's also true that among Hispanic registrants, a sizable share don't register with either party. They're NPAs. And there's a tendency to only look at Florida in terms of Republicans and Democrats. But the fastest growing group are people who say, I don't like either. I would rather choose the individual or the party who reaches out to me in a way that affects my life and my family's life.
Well, what's really interesting too, I want to have you touch on this, is that the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign increased turnout, right? There were more votes for Biden and more votes for Trump than there were in the last election. The Biden campaign was seemingly relying upon African Americans and young people to turn out to vote. And my question to you is, did they? Were they there for Biden, or was there a lack of enthusiasm in those two categories of voters?
We don't have really good data on the turnout yet, but looking at the exit poll, which is what we have to go on right now, it is pretty apparent that young people did turn out. But here's another example of nuances. In really looking carefully at the data, we've been focused a lot this campaign season on the growing younger population, particularly the Gen Zers and the millennials. They were around 31% of our registered voters. There was a tendency to assume that they would really heavily lean towards Biden. And that's because a lot of the activism, starting with Parkland, including climate change, racial justice or injustices, those kinds of issues. But in examining the data, the exit data, it was very clear that the Gen Zers and the millennials were not on the same page. The youngest generation, Gen Z, was for Biden. And it was the issue of racial injustice was one of the top issues.
Interesting.
The generation right above them, the millennials, particularly the older part of the millennials, voted for Trump, and their issue was the economy. And I had a conversation with one of my former students who is a young Republican chair in Hillsborough County about this, and he said that what it was, and he had a lot of conversations about it when he was campaigning, was that the millennials were the ones who had lost their job with the round of restaurant closing, hotel closing, bar closings, all that, which they had as jobs. And once it opened up, they did not want to think about shutting down the economy again. So there's an example. We talked about the nuances within the Latino vote. Well, look at here, you've got a really big nuance in the age makeup. This is why it's so hard to campaign in Florida. Costs a lot of money to do the legwork you need to do.
And here's a pandemic that has an unintended consequence right there. Like, you could never have anticipated that cohort would be in this situation and then feel differently about closures and things like that, and really want to be with the party that's focusing on reopening. So that's a fascinating development. Let me ask you about something that I'm seeing in Florida, and I think it's happening all over the country, is the urban rural divide.
Yes.
It looks like, Georgia, for example, it's, the Atlantification of Georgia, where there's only one huge urban center. Most people now live in that urban center. You might see Georgia turn blue this year, which is kind of unthinkable, right? This happened in Virginia, with Northern Virginia, with all of the folks in that urban area just overwhelmingly dominating the population of the state of Virginia, turning Virginia blue. In Florida, we have all of these city states kind of around the state. Southeast Florida is certainly one megalopolis, and that is solidly blue. But the I-4 corridor is not. You know, you have Tampa and you have Orlando and you have Daytona, but you've got a lot of space in between. But we're seeing places like Seminole County now becoming, not a rural county anymore. It's becoming more of a suburban urban county. So how do you see that? And then I want to throw into that mix too, Jacksonville goes Democrat for the first time, I think, since Jimmy Carter. And when I look back at Jacksonville in the gubernatorial race and saw it went for Gillum, I assumed that was a black population excited about a black candidate. But now I have to think something else is going on. So unpack that for us a little bit about what's happening with the urban-rural divide in Florida.
Well, it's definitely the intersection between age and location and jobs. So what you see is these larger urban areas are magnets for people, young people. This is where the jobs are, the job growth, the excitement, entertainment. And these areas are really promoting that in terms of their economic development in the state. You see a lot of the literature and videos and social media are really trying to bring in younger people who, by the way, a majority, just to show you the intersection between race and age, a majority of our registered young people, the Gen Zers, were a majority non-white already. This is another trend that's starting here, and you're going to see it develop all over the country. These things that we're noticing here, by the way, are examples of why Florida, the most diverse state in every way, is the bellwether. Things that we see here, we're starting to see here, will come other places. But one of the reasons that Georgia has transitioned so much is exactly that. I was involved in a research project on the evolution of the South. And obviously I was looking at Florida, but the state of Georgia, University of Georgia professor Charles Bullock was on the team. And we looked at the demographics had changed dramatically there in terms of who is moving in, and the age has a lot to do it, and why people are moving to Georgia. A lot of corporations have moved to these places because taxes are lower than in the north, a lot of different reasons. And so I think that that's a part of the explanation. But in terms of the vote in the 2020 election the other night, what you really saw was blue Hillsborough and Pinellas, and blue, Orange County and the area in Seminole. And you saw it along the I-4 corridor, the blue parts, the urban. But all of the surrounding suburban counties were red. And the turnout in those areas tends to be a little higher. It was down slightly, but not much. And they vote their pocketbooks. I personally, on election night, pick a few of suburban counties that have middle income residential counties with families with young children. And I noticed from looking at the exit polls, when you looked at people who had young children, they voted differently than others because they're voting their children's interests. And it's true among the suburban women. This year, the suburban voter families, the families were concerned about education and where their kids are going to school. It was a big issue. So suburban areas are also becoming more racially integrated. And so the clearest divide is still between the rural parts of the state, and then you see the suburbans just moving towards the urban, and you have a transition from very rural to very urban, and it makes our politics very fascinating.
And on that point, what do you make of the turn in Jacksonville?
That again is a lot of young people, even the military. If you look at the composition of the military, and there's a sizable military community in that area, the younger military personnel are Democrat. That's a real change. It used to be in the past that if you were in the military, you were clearly Republican. Sure. That's no longer. And you see a lot of
large minority participation in the military, right?
Yes, exactly. And that was one of the big factors, but just the younger people too moving there, because if you look at the Panhandle, that's really the epicenter in terms of the big metropolitan area.
Right. Well, fascinating. Thank you for helping us understand. And I want to leave on this. Give us your big takeaway for both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party after this 2020 election in Florida.
Republicans have got to continue diversifying and including more women and minorities in their base. And Democrats have got to figure out better ways of campaigning and relying less upon national consultants.
Well said. Well said. Well, Dr. MacManus, always great to be with you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom on a Gunster as a view from the top. And for everyone watching, we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.